Howdy biologists! In today's video, I will teach you how to find a most recent common ancestor, what a most recent common ancestor even is, and we will provide 3 different examples to really make sure you know how to, well, find a most recent common ancestor. So let's hop right into it. If you still struggle with concepts such as tips, nodes, and branches of a phylogenetic tree, see my previous video which covers these in depth. For today's video, we will be primarily working with this example phylogeny here, which shows the evolutionary relationships between primate species. Before we get too deep into most recent common ancestors, there are 2 nuances of phylogenetic trees that you need to understand. The first is that information on a phylogenetic tree flows from the root towards the tips of the phylogenetic tree. So again, the root is just going to be it's actually the most recent common ancestor for all of the tips, but information flows from here towards the tips of the tree. Phylogenetic trees are evolutionary relationships over time. Since organisms can't go backwards in time, information will always flow forwards, towards the tips. The second nuance is that phylogenies are hierarchical. We can have groups that are nested within other groups on a phylogeny. For example, on this phylogeny, it is the primates, but we also include the rodents up here. This is our outgroup. We're not covering outgroups in this video, but we could then say that this entire phylogeny represents the mammals. Not all the mammals, of course. Many phylogenies, in fact, most phylogenies, do not include every single possible tip, just because that's impossible. However, let's say here we have the mammals. Okay. Now remember, we are saying that phylogenies are hierarchical. We can create groups within groups, or nested groups. So we could also say that let's find the group within the mammals that includes the primates. So in this case, our phylogeny, our little grouping, would look just like this. So we'd include basically everything on this phylogeny except for the rodents. So let's just draw that out here. These are the primates. But we can even go one step further. We can then find a group that includes only the great apes. And in this case, that would be the orangutan, gorillas, humans, chimpanzees, and bonobos. So what we're really trying to show here is that phylogenies are hierarchical. They can be nested within one another. Let's write out great apes. And this principle is going to be extremely useful whenever we try to find most recent common ancestors. Now let's actually get into how to find a most recent common ancestor. And throughout this, I will be abbreviating most recent common ancestor as MRCA. This is the standard abbreviation you will also see in the literature. The most recent common ancestor is a self-descriptive phrase, but we are going to use the definition of the most recent internal node where 2 tips or 2 groups have diverged from one another. The easiest example we have on this example phylogeny would be the most recent common ancestor between chimpanzees and bonobos. So what is that definition again? It is the most recent internal node that 2 tips or 2 groups have diverged from one another. So if we circle all of the internal nodes that we see here, we have one up here, but we're really looking at this one, and this one. Let's remember that first nuance about phylogenetic trees that we covered. And it is that information flows in one direction in time. Another way to put that is that the older nodes are closer to the root, while the newer nodes are closer to the tips. So when we are asking for a most recent common ancestor, we are looking for the newest node that represents the point where 2 groups or 2 tips have diverged from one another. So if we were asking what is the most recent common ancestor between chimpanzees and bonobos, it would be the most recent node that these 2 have diverged from. So this node right here represents our most recent common ancestor. Biologically speaking, the most recent common ancestor is some organism that these 2 groups diverged from. They are not the organisms at the tips, meaning that this most recent common ancestor is neither a chimpanzee nor a bonobo. It is some other organism from which these 2 groups diverged from. This is also why it's not true to say things like humans evolved from chimpanzees. Rather, because both of us are existing at the same time scale today, they share a common ancestor by which both evolved from. In fact, why don't we find the most recent common ancestor between humans and chimpanzees? Here I will show you a method that will work 100% of the time as long as you follow the steps exactly. And they are: start at a single tip, work your way back to a node, then see if the other tip or the other group you're interested in is descendant from that node. If it is not descendant, go back to another earlier node and try that same process over and over again. So let's demonstrate that with the most recent common ancestor between humans and chimpanzees. So what we're going to do is we're going to follow that procedure very, very carefully. We are going to start at the tip, either tip, it doesn't matter which one you start at, and we're going to work backwards until we hit an internal node. And so if we do that, I'm going to draw it here in green, we work our way back along the branches, and we run into this internal node. Remember, information on a phylogeny flows forward in time. So what we want to do now, from that same procedure I was talking about, is that we are going to see if the other group we are interested in is descendant from that node. So information flows in one direction, so we are not going to go backwards. That is not what we do. Instead, we are going to work forwards. And I'll highlight it with this blue dash line. So we already worked our way from the chimpanzees, but of course, they are descendant from that node. We know that because, well, we ran into the node by going backwards in time. But we can also go the other way. Every single node diverges in two pathways. So let's work our way the other way. And that would be towards bonobos. So we determined earlier that the most recent common ancestor between chimps and bonobos is actually this node. However, we see that humans are not descendant from that node. So what we need to do then is find a different internal node. We'll work our way backwards to the next one and then run that same procedure over again. So let's work our way backwards until we hit another internal node. Oopsies, there we go. And now we're going to see are chimpanzees and humans descendant from that node? Now, we've already determined that chimpanzees are descendant from that node. In fact, whatever tip you started on will always be descendant from the nodes that you run into. If you trace it out this way, every single node you run into will be descendant. Every single node you run into will have that tip you started at as a descendant. So we've already gone this way, but I'm going to highlight it just for demonstrative purposes. We can see that following this blue dotted line, we can run into the chimpanzees. But let's run the other way. And of course, what we see is that we run into the human tip. So because we have determined that this is the first internal node, the most recent internal node that contains both humans and chimpanzees as a descendant, we know that this node is our most recent common ancestor. That's all we have to do. We found the most recent common ancestor for humans and chimpanzees just by working our way backwards from the tip to each node and then determining if they have both of the groups we are interested in as a descendant. Obviously, this example was very simple. So let's work through three more that are a bit more complex. This example phylogeny shows the same evolutionary relationships as the previous phylogeny. However, I rotated many of the tips around the nodes. All phylogenies, you can rotate at each node, and that does not change the evolutionary relationships. That's also why things like the order of the tips on a phylogeny doesn't matter at all. So, on this example phylogeny, we want to find the most recent common ancestor between gorillas and gibbons. So I'll underline them in blue here. All we're going to do is we're going to do that exact same process as before. I'm going to still do this a little bit slower just so you can see it in action. By the end of this video, you're probably going to be able to just look at a phylogeny and tell what the most recent common ancestor is, but let's figure out a system so that you can get to that point. And let's start with the gorilla tip. Again, it doesn't matter which tip you start with, but I'm going to start with the gorilla one just because it's a little more complicated way of doing it. I'll also show you how to do it if you started at the Gibbon tip, as it's actually much faster. But you don't always know which one is faster before you start. So let's start at the gorilla, and we're going to work our way backwards until we hit our first internal node, our most recent internal node. And what we're going to now see are gorillas and gibbons descendant from this node. Because we worked our way backwards from gorillas, we already know they are descendant. But let's work down the other pathway, as all nodes diverge into two pathways, and let's see, are the gibbons descendant from this node? So we'll work our way up. Again, we're not going to go backwards in time for this step, as information on a phylogeny flows from root to tip. But we can see that descendant from that node, we find humans, which are not gibbons. We can go this way, and we can also find that at this intersection point, we have the bonobos and the chimpanzees, which are descendant. However, none of those are gibbons, and there are no other pathways for us to go down. So what do we do? Now, starting at that last internal node we were at, we're just going to work our way backwards again until we hit another internal node. So let's go backwards until we hit some internal node. And now that we're here, let's figure out what descendants are from this node and if they include both gorillas and gibbons. We've already worked our way backwards from the gorilla, so we know it's included. We don't need to go and map out humans, bonobos, and chimpanzees again, as, again, phylogenies are hierarchical. They are nested from one another. So if you go backwards in time, you are already including all of the tips and nodes that are downstream from there. However, because we have not gone down the other pathway, the second of the diverging pathways, let's do that very quickly. And if we go up this way, we can see that it leads directly to the orangutan. Now, orangutans are not gibbons, so what do? We go backwards again to another internal node. And I hope you see that now that we're at this internal node, we already know gorillas are descendant from this node due to the hierarchical nature of phylogenies. But if we go the other way, we see, hey, look at that. We have the gibbon. So this is the first internal node we ran into, or otherwise known as the most recent internal node, that includes both gorillas and gibbons as a descendant, which means this is our most recent common ancestor. So that wasn't too bad. And of course, we're going very, very slow just to make this more clear. But let's do it from the gibbon side. Let's not start with gorillas. Let's start from the gibbons and just show that this process will work no matter what tip you start with. So same thing. We start at the gibbon, and we're going to work our way backwards until we hit our first internal node. And that would be this one right here. Now, we just determined this is the most recent common ancestor, right? But imagine you did not see the gorilla example at all, and you do not know if this is the most recent common ancestor. So, from this node, we are going to track all of the descendants and see if they include gorillas and gibbons. And we've already done this once, so we'll go here, start at this node, and we'll work our way up. We see that it hits the orangutans, not a gorilla. So let's go down the other branching pathway. We'll go this way. We hit this internal node, and, of course we can go this way and we can track if bonobos or chimpanzees are, there, but you're not going to do that. You see gorilla is here, and you see you can go down from this internal node to get to the gorilla. And what you find is that this internal node is including the gorilla as its descendant. So then, what is our most recent common ancestor? Well, remember, we started at the gibbon, and we went backwards until we hit this internal node here. Then we were just checking if the gorillas were descendant from this node as well as the gibbons. So it's not this is not our most recent common ancestor, this is not our most recent common ancestor, it would be this one right here. Now, I said it was a little bit easier. I think it is, just because you're starting from the gibbon and you can see very quickly just by following this single pathway here in blue that it includes both gorillas and gibbons. So that is just the method that we use to find the most recent common ancestor. And you can see that it works either way. Doesn't matter if you started with gorillas or started with gibbons. So let's do another example that's a little bit more complicated. For this example, we are going to use a different phylogeny. This one shows the evolutionary relationships between various viper species using the corn snake as an outgroup. And we want to know what is the most recent common ancestor between the puff adder and the eyelash viper. So again, doesn't matter which one we start with. We'll just start with the puff adder, just because. And going through that process again, I'll make sure we do this one a little bit faster. We work our way backwards until we hit some internal node. And then we determine, are both of the groups we're interested in descendant from this node? Once again, evolutionary information flows from root to tip. So if we go from this node downwards, well, we see that the sawscale viper is not an eyelash viper. So what we do is, going back to that internal node we started with, we are going to work backwards until we hit another internal node. Now, we are going to check if both the puff adder and the eyelash viper are descendant from this node. So we know the puff adder is. We've already tracked that part of the phylogeny down. Since we started the puff adder, we know any node we run into will be descendant from the, or will have the puff adder as a descendant. So starting from this node, though, let's see if the eyelash viper is descendant. And I'm sure you can already look at it and see, but if we go this way, we hit this node. If we go up this pathway, we run into the Bushmaster. That's not an eyelash viper. So let's continue down a different pathway. Ooh, there we go. We hit this internal node, and what we'll do is we'll go up first, just for no real reason. We hit this internal node, check all of its descendants. Well, we see the fertilances there, but we also see the eyelash viper. So because we have worked our way down all the descendants, and again, we started at this internal node, and from that internal node, it was the first one we ran into that includes both the puff adder and the eyelash viper, we know that this is our MRCA, our most recent common ancestor. So even in examples that are a tiny bit more complex, we find that this methodology works every single time. And just to really hammer home the point, let's try it starting from the eyelash viper and seeing if we can find a group that includes, see if we can find the exact same thing. So starting from the eyelash viper, we go up, we hit this internal node. Diverging from this node, we find that the descendants are just the fertilans and the eyelash viper. So we're going to keep going backwards until we hit another internal node. From here, we go downstream and we check, just being thorough. We see that the descendants are the rattlesnake, hit this internal node. From there, we see the descendants are the cottonmouth and the copperhead. We're out of descendants to look for, and none of those were the puff adder. So we go back to this node, hit another internal node. We then go forwards in time, check all the descendants. Here it's just the Bushmaster and the groups we've already checked. So again, not a puff adder. We go backwards in time again to another internal node. And we check all of its descendants. So we go up, we see here that we run into this internal node and we actually get the sawscale viper. That's not it. But if we go the other way, of course, we hit the puff adder. And again, doesn't matter which one we started with, from either the puff adder or the eyelash viper, we find either way, this is our most recent common ancestor. Cool. I have one more example for you. This is that exact same viper phylogeny. I haven't rotated it or anything like that. But we are wanting to find the most recent common ancestor between the USA vipers and the Bushmaster. So we have the Bushmaster here. Let's keep this consistent with blue. But what do we mean by the USA vipers? So again, with a most recent common ancestor, I've been saying it is the most recent diverging point between two tips or two groups. So it could also be a tip and a group, I guess, which is what we're doing here. So let's figure out what we define by the USA vipers. On this phylogeny here, we are going to define those groups as the rattlesnake, the cottonmouth, and the copperhead. I believe there's some historical records of eyelash vipers and maybe a fertilans in some parts of the US, but we're not going to worry about those. Instead, we're just going to focus on rattlesnake, cottonmouth, and copperheads. So in reality, what we're kind of asking is not just what is the most recent common ancestor of US vipers and Bushmaster. we're really asking, what is the most recent common ancestor between bushmasters, rattlesnakes, cottonmouths, and copperheads? So let's first start by finding, and I guess making, the group USA vipers. What we do is we make a monophyletic group, which is something we'll cover later on, but let's just find the most recent common ancestor for the rattlesnakes, cottonmouths, and copperheads so we can draw a big circle around them. If we do this process pretty quickly, if we go this way, cottonmouth, copperheads here, we find that this internal node, if we look at the descendants, it does include both cottonmouths and copperheads, which we are interested in. However, it doesn't include the rattlesnake. So what do? We go backwards, find a different internal node, and check again. Well, guess what? From this internal node, all the descendants include rattlesnakes, cottonmouths, and copperheads. This is our USA vipers group. What I'll do is I'll just draw a big circle around all of it just so we can see what we mean by a group. This is a monophyletic group, very quickly. That's just the ancestor in all of its descendants. That's a monophyletic group, very simply. Again, we'll cover that in a different video. But we now have the USA vipers group, and we want to see what is their most recent common ancestor with the Bushmaster. So what do? We just do the same thing we've been doing. We work our way backwards from that internal node and find the next internal node. So starting from here, the group, the internal node, that is the most recent common ancestor for rattlesnakes, cottonmouths, and copperheads. And we work our way until we find another internal node. Now we check if all the descendants are the groups that we are interested in, so the Bushmaster and the vipers. We already know that all the USA vipers are represented. They are all descendant from that node because we have worked our way upstream. But let's go downstream now. And we find that we run into the Fertilants and the Eyelash vipers. Neither of those are the Bushmaster. So what do? We go backwards again to another internal node. And here we check the descendants. We already know the USA vipers are included. And of course, if we go the other way, we see that we have the Bushmaster right here, which means this is the first internal node, the most recent internal node, that contains both the Bushmaster and USA vipers as its descendants, meaning this is the most recent common ancestor. So I used this example to show that you can look for the most recent common ancestor between groups or between individual tips. You could also run this for multiple groups, right? Or multiple tips. It doesn't have to just be species A and species B. It could be the most recent common ancestor between, for example, the Bushmaster, rattlesnakes, cottonmouths, and copperheads. So if this video was helpful, hey, give it a subscribe, give it a like, leave a comment. I'm a very small YouTube channel, so everything helps at this stage. But if you are interested in learning more, this is going to be a longer series. And the last video covered tips, nodes, branches, branch lengths, and roots. If you want to take your tree reading skills to the next level, my 3-part program, Reading Phylogenies, might just be for you. This program covers the core components of phylogenetic trees, phylogenetic groups and what they mean, as well as common misconceptions and misunderstandings when it comes to reading phylogenies. All of my courses contain video lectures, written text, as well as quizzes and mastery checks designed to cement your understanding of the concepts. You can find the link down in the description. Thank you. But with that, I hope you have an absolutely wonderful day. Thank you.